Hey, what's going on? My name's Robert and you are watching Southpaw Autoworks. This is the Turbo 400. This episode is all about the valve body. We're going to install a kit, install that valve body onto the trans, and while we're at it, we're going to tackle both of the servos. Without further ado, let's dive in.
Okay, so we're on to the valve body on this unit. I kind of showed you a little bit on the shift kit before. We're using the Transgo, the one I recommend. Good kit, not very expensive. Gives you some updated springs for your pressure regulator valve and the pump, as well as a few for the valve body. It's a pretty simple kit to install. Okay, not a lot to it, but he does give you a lot of literature, a lot of information about rebuilding and stuff that you need to know. The valve body, like I said, is pretty straightforward on this. Basically, all we're going to do is replace one spring in the valve body. There is an optional spring on here. I don't normally use that for a more sensitive 3/2 part throttle downshift. So what we're going to do is we're going to go after and install this blue spring here, just in the 2-3 valve train. So we'll take our pin here out. May have to push in on the sleeve a little bit because we do have some spring tension. Take that pin out, and there's our spring literally right there at the end of the bore. Okay, this valve body has not been cleaned up as well as it should have been. I would definitely brake clean this out, but for our demonstration, I'm not going to take the time to do all that. So anyway, we take that spring out, replace it with the blue spring that he gives you. Simply put that in its place, and then we'll push that back in again, feed the pin, and then we may have to work the spring a little bit. Probably a bigger screwdriver would be better for this job, but there we go. We got past it. And then we just have to make sure that when we put the pin back in the valve body, any of these, they have to sit below flush. As simple as that. So the rest of the valves, we are going to want to make sure that they're free. What they used to call in the business is kind of a little flick test. You go in here and just check each one of the valves and make sure that they're free in the bore. Make sure there's no chunks of dirt or metal or anything in there that's hanging them up. Okay. If we have a unit that's got a lot of heavy metal contamination, then we're probably going to want to strip this valve body completely. I'm going to take each pin out, each valve train out, lay it out in order so that you can keep track of it, okay? And then clean it all up real good with some brake clean, blow it out good, put them all back in again. These being a cast iron valve body with a steel valve, usually don't have too many troubles with the valves sticking or hanging up. It's when we get into some of the other units with aluminum valves, or aluminum valve body and a steel valve, they'll really stick, and then you've got to be really, really clean with the unit. This being evidently an earlier transmission, it has a pressure switch right here, which was actually what we'd call smog switch back in the day. Okay, this hooked to a wire and the transmission ran up to the engine, and when the transmission shifted into high gear, they would retard the engine timing for smog purposes back in the day. These switches are prone to leakage, okay? They're not necessary. Nobody has the smog equipment on something this old anyway. So what you're gonna wanna do is unscrew this, throw it away, and just put a regular pipe tap or pipe plug back in that hole. Because if this leaks, that actually creates a leak in a circuit, which would be feeding your direct clutch, which would create a slippage or a premature failure of that clutch. So we don't want that risk take. So we take that out, put a plug in its place. Next step we're going to do, we've got 2 metal rings left out of our sealing ring kit here. Okay, same size. They're a butt type ring. One's going to go on this accumulator piston. That's what they call this guy right here. And the other one's going to go on the servo. That's going to go in the case. So we're going to replace both of those. In order to replace this guy, we've got a heavy spring underneath. We've got to compress this down, release a little clip inside here, take the piston out, replace the ring that's on there, and then recompress it to put it back together. One thing I wanted to tell you about can be a problem on the later model 400s. they replaced the aluminum piston with a plastic piston. Okay, those are prone to breakage. Take those, throw them away, get yourself an aluminum piston to go back in its place if that's what you have. The aluminum itself is fine. If you already have it, replace the ring, put it back in, you're good to go.
Real quick, if this type of content is adding value, please let us know by hitting that like button. It does help the channel, and we do greatly appreciate your feedback.
Okay, so our servo here that we're going to put the ring on, just a note, what's on here right now is a solid plastic or Teflon type of ring. We're going to have to pick that out of there, break it to get it out of there, and then we're going to replace it with this. A little tougher to install once we go into the bore and the case, because you have to carefully compress this ring like a piston ring as you insert this into the case. I'll show you that when we get to that point. Same thing with the accumulator piston and the valve body. Because of that butt type ring, when we go to install that piston back in the valve body, we got to be real gentle with it. Very easy to break this ring going back together. But it's a fight. Remember, you can't quite get it deep enough to get the snap ring out. And you got to make sure you don't get a face full of fluid. Okay. Got her close. And a little closer. That's real close. One more try here. Let's see if she works. That'll work right there. Yeah. The trick is going to be getting it back together. So
I've got an E-clip installer.
Okay. So there's our piston. Solid ring on there that we've got to cut off and replace with the metal ring. Okay. Okay, so we need to remove the old ring off of this accumulator piston. Basically just cutting it, peeling it off of here, whatever we got to do. Try not to nick up the groove here where the sealing ring rides. Okay. And we just simply slip that over the piston. And then once again, we've got to be very careful going back together because we've got to get this squeezed back together to get it to drop into the bore, into the valve body while fighting this spring. So I'm going to do that. Don't know if I can do this by hand with just the pliers, but we're going to try it. There, lucky so far. There it is. The nut. Okay, put our E-clip back on here. All right. And then we release the pliers. That's it right there. We'll do the same thing for that servo piston that goes in the case. Cut that ring off, tear it off of there. Many times in your overhaul kits and so forth, you're going to be replacing one type of a sealing ring with another. Could be a plastic with a scarf cut or a butt type or whatever. Perfectly normal. Your aftermarket companies have come up with upgrades and so forth to go on here that work better. And that'll be that guy. And we'll show you how that installs in the case.
Need parts, tools, and or supplies for your Turbo 400 build? Be sure and check out the resources section in the video description down below.
One of the last things we're going to do on the valve body just before we install it in the case is our governor feed tubes. Okay. Going to go in the two holes here at the bottom of the valve body, if you will. Okay. Both tubes same length, doesn't matter which position they go in. Okay. One other thing that I might mention, in your overhaul kit's going to be, that's going to be your governor screen. Okay. That's got to go into your governor feed tube here in order to filter, if you will, additionally filter the fluid that's going into the governor itself. Okay. Governor's got a valve inside of it that has to move freely, just like the valves in the valve body. If you get trash in here, contamination, it's going to hang that valve up. Your transmission's either going to take off in second or third gear or not upshift at all. This is a way of filtering it so that we stop any contamination from getting to that governor. Some of the reference books will tell you where that installs as far as which tube to install it. I can never remember off the top of my head, so what I do is I look and see where those holes are feeding to in the valve body, because what you're going to have is oil that's going to be fed off of the manual valve. Okay, that's the guy that's moving when you're moving the shifter, when you select drive, reverse, whatever the position may be. He's going to feed oil over to one of the two passages, to one of the tubes that's feeding the oil to the governor itself. The other one's going to be your governor feed back out again. We want to stop the contamination on the way into the governor itself. So we're going to trace that down and figure out which one of those. And then what you do is this literally just installs in the end of the tube itself and then into the valve body, thereby screening the oil or filtering the oil going to the governor. So in this case, we've got oil going from the manual valve feeding into the tube that's on this side. So that's the one we're going to want to put our screen in. So put that there. This one here. Okay, we're ready to put our valve body on, but we've got to put a couple servos in here first. The low reverse servo goes down here. That's this guy here. We did assembly on a little bit earlier in the video. New rubber seal here. New rings on the accumulator piston. Okay. And your big spring here that goes in the center. So we've got to straighten out our accumulator piston. It's a little cockeyed in the bore there. That's got one of the butt type sealing rings on it. So if you're not careful, you'll break that. Get that restarted in that while holding that ring. Okay, make sure it's centered. That guy goes in. So, little assembly lube on both of the bores here for this low reverse servo. All right. And then we're going to flip our assembly over. Drop that in there. All right. Now, this has a metal gasket to seal it. We've got to line that up with all the bolt holes in the passages. Flip it over. Looks like we're pretty close right there. And then the cover.
Installing the servo gasket and the cover onto the transmission case can be done quite quickly if you know what to look for. The metal gasket has an impression stamped into it. That impression is in the shape of a perfect circle going all the way around the gasket with the exception of this spot right here. So this portion of the gasket lines up with this portion of the transmission case. This is actually where the oil comes in and makes its way into the servo cover and applies the servo. So the gasket could be put on one of two ways. If we cover that port with the gasket flipped this way, we can see that the gasket does not line up with any of the bolt holes that are in the transmission case. But if we flip it, line it up again, now all of the holes line up. This section of the cover lines up with this section of the gasket, like so.
6 bolts on this guy. And the thing to remember on this is to work with it slowly. Do not force it into the bore, and do not run the bolts down real quick. You can bind up that piston, create issues. So I like to kind of work it a little bit at a time, work the bolts. So what I'll do is I'll just kind of do a little cross section here, tighten these up as I go, working it down a little bit until I get it flush with the case. Like I said, don't force it, don't push it too fast.
With the servo and each of these bolts bottomed against the transmission case, we're now ready to torque the bolts down to spec. We torque them to 18 foot-pounds. Furthermore, we utilize the star pattern, and we also make one revolution or one pass all the way around the servo cover, tightening each of these bolts as we go, just to make sure that we didn't miss any bolts.
Got our servo installed, we've got the cover tightened down here. We can do a quick little air check on that servo just like we did with the clutches. Come over here to this hole in the case at the bottom, and then there. Okay. Tough to get the rubber tip down in there just right, but when we do, we get a decent air check. Little leakage around the rubber tip, no big deal. Next, we'll put in the intermediate servo. To show you the order of things in this, which way it goes in, we've got a spring. We got a little spring retainer. You've got your pin. It's got a little groove in it right there, okay? A little cut in it, okay? Got your piston that slides over that, and then hopefully you haven't lost your little clip that goes in here, all right? That's it, just sets in that groove. Piston comes down, rests against that. What I would do on these usually is I'll grab the pin, pushing down on the piston to hold that clip in place. Put my spring and my retainer down into the case and still holding pressure against this so I don't lose my clip. I'm going to install that. Now, we've got to worry about our butt type cast iron sealing ring, so I'm going to take my pocket screwdriver as a tool, and I'm going to work on that while holding a little pressure down on the piston. Push that down in place. We're down against the band itself. Okay? Simple as that. Just don't want to force it, don't want to break that sealing ring. Once it's installed, that clip will stay in place. No need to try and fasten that in any fashion. So, next, and a cool thing here, shift kit. You remember when you took your transmission apart, you got all the check balls that fell out, don't know where they go back in. Nice picture to explain for you right here on where all the check balls go, all the locations, okay? He'll tell you how many check balls, 6 of them, they're 1/4 inch in size, and just install them just the way he says. Sometimes it'll be a little bit different or maybe different in the count on how many check balls were in there before. This transmission really only requires 2 check balls to function, and a lot of guys will leave them out sometimes to make for a harder shift. That's another thing we would cover in another video to explain how that works for you. But in this case, I recommend you put all 6 back in again. Okay? So we'll install those in each of the pockets in the valve body, okay? And then he gives you 2 new gaskets and the new separator plate I mentioned before. Cool that he gives you a new separator plate because the check balls do beat against the separator plate, and they will tear up the plate a little bit. These plates quite often get rusted. And also, the guys will go in here from previous rebuilds and they'll punch out some of the holes much larger to try and make a harder shift, okay? Like he and I would recommend, if you want a harder shift, don't buy the basic valve body kit, buy what they call the -2 kit, okay? That's for the harder shifts. That's gonna be a different plate, different hole sizes, different everything to do with the pressure regulator, valve spring, and so forth, okay? This is just to kind of recalibrate this thing the way it should have been from the factory. Now that it's worn, springs are weak, plates beat up, and so forth. So, gaskets are positional, okay? You've got one that's supposed to go against the case, then your plate and your second gasket, okay? These are marked if you look very carefully. That's supposed to be a letter C, which indicates case gasket. Okay, so that one would go down against the case itself, all right? Once we get our check balls in place, of course. And then your plate would go on, and then this one would go on top, and this would be considered valve body gasket, okay? So once again, if you can see the letters there, VB, valve body gasket. That way you know which gasket goes on which side of the plate. So we would put the check balls in place, and what I normally use, a couple of guide pins, which are just bolts cut off, or pins, and a couple different positions on there. What that's gonna do for me, it's gonna hold the gaskets and the plate in place a little bit so I can get it assembled. There, and then our valve body gasket, okay? And at this point, what I would recommend is you install the detent solenoid, which is bolted on right here, okay? Once again, I'm gonna put those bolts in, but I'm not gonna tighten them down at this point. A little side note on these, this is what your detent solenoid looked like from the factory. It was used for many, many years, okay? That installs with this little tin gasket underneath it, okay? And then that would bolt down here against the separator plate. Just a little note on that. If you're replacing the solenoid, because they do fail, they do become contaminated, the replacement solenoid you're gonna get is not gonna look like this. It's gonna be quite a bit different, and it will not require this gasket. If you flip over the new solenoid, what it's gonna do is it's gonna have a rubber seal here, thereby eliminating this gasket. It would bolt directly to the plate itself. But the one we have is going to use this gasket, and it's going to take 2 very small bolts, which I can't find. And I'm going to bolt that on, like I said, right now before I do the valve body. And I'm not going to tighten them up. We're going to leave those loose. All right. That is going to connect electrically to the case connector, which goes through the case itself, and that'll plug in the side there. Okay, so we've got our plate and our gaskets on. Okay, we've got our detent solenoid. We're leaving the bolts loose. Now, a side note here, and he brings this to your attention in the shift kit. Most all of your valve bodies and separator plates have 2 holes that are going to be used for alignment, okay? So if you notice here in the shift kit, he tells you which those are. He calls them the Z holes here, okay? So what the idea here is to always install those 2 bolts first, okay? The tolerances on the valve body hole and the hole in the plate are generally tighter or smaller on the Z holes or alignment holes. And you can find this true on most any transmission. So we're not necessarily going to use for our guide pins, but when we put our valve body on, those will be 2 bolts that will get tightened up first before the rest of them. And that'll help keep the plate and everything aligned a little bit more accurately. So we've got the valve body ready to go on. We've got our governor tube screen in. We got our manual valve on. What we've got to do is flip this guy over. All right. We'll use our guide pins to help us. We've got to start the governor tubes into the case as we go. And you're going to find it's a little bit awkward because the tubes are going to fight you a little bit. And they're not going to want to get started in the case right away. So you've got to work it a little bit. At least get them started. Right? And then what you're going to do is lightly tap those tubes in place. And we've got to get our manual valve lined up here. Right? With the linkage. Right? So slot in the manual valve, hooks up into your linkage right here. So we've got the manual valve hooked up, we've got the governor tube started. We're going to work those in a little bit as we go. Okay, pushing down on the valve body. And then we're going to take 2 bolts and put those in those 2 alignment holes first. All right. That's going to help try and keep everything lined up a little bit better. All right. This one does take a detent spring and roller right here. So we want to put that in position. All right. Now we've got those in, we need to try and get our alignment pins back out. That one's going to be a little tougher to get out. Basically, your valve body bolts are the same length. You got 2 different sizes of them, and those are pretty obvious for position. These are all the larger holes, and then you've got 3 small bolts that go across there.
With the solenoid and the valve body bolts all bottomed, we're now ready to tighten the bolts down to spec. They get torqued to 90 inch-pounds. In addition to them getting tightened, we also utilize the spiral pattern. After we've done the spiral pattern, we like to make one last pass across all of the bolts just to make sure that we didn't miss any along the way.
Okay, valve body on. We've got it torqued to specs. We've got our detent solenoid. That's one you don't want to forget about. Guys will forget to tighten that down. No upshift condition if you leave those loose. Okay, and then just for GP, I give governor tubes a couple more love taps there. Make sure they're in all the way. Double check our manual valve operation and the detent. Okay, make sure we're connected properly and all our detents work good. All right.
This show is a ton of hours to produce, and we could use your support. You can learn more by checking out the video description down below. So we just got done going through the Turbo 400 valve body. We're working our way through this build series, and we are coming down to the tail end of it. However, we've still got to install a filter, a pan, a modulator, as well as a governor, and maybe some other things that are slipping my mind. Point is, if you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell too, so you don't miss out on any upcoming videos. Once again, my name's Robert, and I will see you next time.